The reason the polling for the president is as bad as it is because presidents get credit and blame for the economy. And out of the gate, I think, as a matter of intellectual honesty, I got to say, I have long maintained presidents of the United States are not largely to blame. They can make things worse, and I do believe Biden has with some of his policies. They were warned about the COVID spending package and how it would contribute to inflation. They denied that. They decided that they could rethink things. And the fallout has a lot to do with the Biden administration thinking they could change this. We've got a series of economic problems in the country, all of which are caused by different policy solutions and different policy problems, including global problems and solutions related to COVID, the shutdowns, the lockdowns, the supply chain issue in large part has to do with COVID. More than anything else, the supply chain problems are impacted by COVID. It's not really Biden's fault. The problem is this president campaigned saying who could fix it all. And you can't fix things that are outside your control. But in a campaign, your campaign tends to lack humility, regardless of who you are. And the result is you make promises, and voters expect you, if you're going to make the promise, live up to the promise. And they can't live up to the promise. Now, there's something else going on here as well, and there's a dynamic here that I think you've got to understand. And I need to lay out some history for you. The Jimmy Carter team, actually, you know what? Let me go back before that, and let me give you a little history here to put everything in context. So you had in 1960, Dwight Eisenhower was term limited, and his vice president ran for president. You've probably heard of him. His name was Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon was not a charismatic guy, not good on television. Television was a new thing. Televised presidential debates were a new thing. There's that old anecdote that people who listened on radio thought Nixon won. People who watched on TV thought Kennedy won. Kennedy won. Now, Kennedy won because it was one of those few elections where there probably was a close enough election and enough hanky-panky in Chicago and Texas that it's arguable that Nixon should have won the race, but he didn't. And we moved on. And Kennedy became president. He was the young, the old people in the media now were young people then. And they get priapism thinking about the Kennedy days between Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy. They absolutely adored him. They loved him. It was a new world. It was a new way of thinking. It was a new time to move forward. And then Kennedy is assassinated. And you have Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson was an old school Texan leader of the Senate, master of the Senate, knew how to get things done, becomes president, is not a nice person. And ultimately, with the Vietnam situation inherited by Kennedy that he escalates, he's thrown out of office. And you have this young, angsty, progressive wing of the Democratic Party that surges forward, trying to take over power, and they are stopped by who? Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had lost to Kennedy, rebounds in 1968, becomes president of the United States, and is a liberal Republican. Richard Nixon brought us the EPA. Richard Nixon brought us price controls. Richard Nixon brought us wage controls. Richard Nixon brought us a lot of the policies that Democrats now favor to deal with inflation and the like. Richard Nixon brought them. Don Rumsfeld, I knew. He was George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense. And Richard Nixon, when Rumsfeld worked for him, Rumsfeld insisted on putting a guy you may have heard of named Dick Cheney in charge of the wage and labor regulations for controls. And the reason Cheney and Rumsfeld did this, and I've heard the story from both of them. I knew both men. I know Cheney. The reason that Rumsfeld put Cheney in charge of it is because Rumsfeld knew it would be a disaster and knew if he put Cheney in charge of it, it would slow walk everything. And the brakes would be hit, they would slow down, and things would not advance. And they did. They largely were able to obstruct Richard Nixon internally. Nixon, of course, was a son of the Cold War, and also began realigning the world and realizing if we could get China on our side against Russia, the Chinese and Russians were regularly in border wars against each other, that we could build a real alliance against the Soviet Union. For the longest time, it worked. The fallout, of course, we're dealing with now, but at the time, short-term thinking, it actually worked fairly well. For only Nixon could go to China, they said, not just Spock. Was able to go to China and get China on our side. But in any event, Nixon, of course, has the fallout from Watergate. Ford becomes president. Ford's a moderate Republican. Ford loses to Carter, and Carter's kind of a shakeup of the Democratic Party. A governor from the South pulls together a Southern constituency, becomes president of the United States over an aggressive Democratic elite, and is able to win. Now, who are the people? Some of these people, if you're familiar with the dynamics of American politics from the 60s and 70s, you've heard of Jerry Brown, longtime governor of California. You've heard of George Wallace of Alabama, Mo Udall from Arizona, Henry Jackson from Washington, and Frank Church of the Church Commission from Idaho. Carter wins. The governor of Georgia, he wins. Consolidates the South, does very well, sweeps through the South. His only major rival in the South is George Wallace. Out west, he's got to deal with Frank Church, but he does well. He gets it, and he becomes the president, and there is economic catastrophe. OPEC embargoes, oil lines, crises, and Jimmy Carter does not have the fortitude to withstand it. He is out to lunch, out to pasture, and doesn't really understand the way Washington works. And so who's his big rival in 1980? It's Ronald Reagan. And Reagan comes in and he's got this thing that George H.W. Bush in the Republican primary challenged him on called voodoo economics. And Reagan's ideas are, what's his name? His idea is supply side economics. That instead of the government stimulating demand, let's stimulate some supply. Let's increase the availability of cash in the economy through the free market, through deregulation, through the cutting of taxes, increase people's available supply of their own money, not making new money, but people's access to their own money through cutting taxes, and the economy would take off. And Ronald Reagan's tax plan set in a 30 to 40-year economic boom in the United States. Now, you got to understand that the Republican moderates tried to contain it. They had Howard Baker run. They had Bob Dole run. They had George H.W. Bush run. All of them were running to stop Reagan. And in fact, I remember I had to write a paper on this one time. They literally were openly trying to stop the conservatives. They were trying to stop the conservative momentum of Ronald Reagan, and they failed. And the compromise was George H.W. Bush as his vice president. They thought he would have some moderating influence. Nancy Reagan had a more moderating influence than George H.W. Bush did on Ronald Reagan, and Reagan was beloved. George H.W. Bush was one of the very few men in American history to win a third term for an incumbent president's party. Usually, an incumbent president's party serves 2 terms and then is gone, but Reagan was so popular, 76% American approval rating when he leaves office. George H.W. Bush is elected to be him, to be his third term, and when he becomes his own man, he loses. He break his word. He had this very famous moment of read my lips, no new taxes, and then he raised taxes, and the American people turned their back on him, and they went with the young guy from Arkansas. George H.W. Bush was a hero. In 1990, after the invasion of Iraq and the Gulf War, his popularity rivaled only George Washington, and I'm not actually exaggerating. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but in several polls, George H.W. Bush had popularity over 90%. We have never seen that before or since in American history, except for, you assume, George Washington. 90% public approval rating, and then he loses to Bill Clinton. In fact, he was so popular, the Democrats wanted Mario Cuomo to run against him, the governor of New York. The Democrats loved Cuomo. Cuomo was their guy. And Cuomo refused. He's like, I'm not running against this guy. All of the major Democrats refused. And so the southern upstart governor with women problems, Bill Clinton, was the sacrificial lamb. And no one thought he could win. And he did. And his message was, George H.W. Bush is a fine man, but he's been in Washington. He's out of touch. It's time to move on. Don't stop thinking about tomorrow was their campaign song, and it was all about the economy, stupid. It was the economy, stupid. And they won on the economy. And they said they were going to do a new way of thinking, but they didn't really. They didn't really. They didn't really change the way they think. Now, they certainly used Democrat thinking, not supply-side economics like Reagan, but there was a new Democratic leadership, was the moderate Democratic group, and the yellow dogs, or the blue dogs, rather, of the South, who were conservative Democrats. And then Clinton was such a morally flawed, failed person. Southern Democrats who were already turning towards Republicans, they flipped dramatically. And the Republicans began to take up office. And in 1994, for the first time in 40 years, Republicans took control of the United States House of Representatives. Let me say that again. For the first time in 40 years, Republicans took over in 1994 and have largely controlled Congress ever since, with just a few Democratic years here and there. It was a major reversal and realignment in the country because of Bill Clinton, who went on to win a second term, and the Republicans held on. Then you have the 2000 race. George W. Bush comes in, and then Democrats get Barack Obama. And Barack Obama is a progressive. He comes in against gay marriage, ultimately supports gay marriage, is pro-abortion. Socially, he's a progressive, but he's still kind of a run-of-the-mill Democrat when it comes to economics. Trump, of course, comes in, is deeply disruptive, but Trump aligns himself with a bunch of people in the Republican Party who are status quo Republicans. They're supply-siders, the run-of-the-mill economic policies, and frankly, if I were to give you a list of things that happened in the Trump administration, politically, substantive policy-wise, not the rhetoric, not the mean tweets, but the actual policies accomplished, and I were to give you those, you wouldn't be able to tell which Republican put those forward. They were run-of-the-mill Republicans. And this is something people forget. And all the outrage over Donald Trump, the man, Donald Trump's presidency was a pretty typical Republican presidency in terms of policies advanced. And all along the way, there's this thing happening in the undercurrents. Democrats, they got Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton betrayed their progressivism to become a run-of-the-mill economic Democrat, pro-business Democrat. Barack Obama then comes in, and Barack Obama starts out as this progressive hard charger, bust the unions, break up the big companies, and he turns out to be a run-of-the-mill Democrat, pro-business Democrat. Well, now progressives finally have Joe Biden. Joe Biden, an 80-year-old who clearly has mentally diminished, and I don't mean that critically, it's just true. You talk to anyone privately who knows Joe Biden, he's not the same Joe Biden of just 4 years ago. And the progressives have embedded themselves within the Democratic apparatus. It was going to be Hillary Clinton. She was going to right the wrongs. All the progressives were going to embed within her because they couldn't get Bernie Sanders, and now it's Joe Biden. A middle-of-the-road, mushy, moderate Democrat who's liberal on social issues, but no one to rock the boat on fiscal issues, and the progressives pack into the White House. And now is their moment. Now is their time. When Larry Summers came out and said, hey, guys, wait a second, slow down. You can't do this. You're going to get inflation. They said, inflation no longer matters. We have modern monetary theory. We can print money and buy our way out of the crisis. You do not have to worry about it. We're going to be fine. And the economy blows up in their face. Progressives finally got what they wanted. They got a presidency that they could dominate, they could control, and not just on social stuff, which they always get, they could control on economic stuff as well. The progressives could set the economic policies of the United States and push the legislation that they want. And now they're roadblocked in Congress, but they're getting their way on the executive side. And what's happening? The economy's faltering. They're trying to say it's good. It's not. Inflation's going up. Gas prices are going up. People are getting angry. Progressives have gotten their way, and they're about to lose it all. It's the consequence of having your cake and eating it too in politics. They get exactly what they wanted. They're going to say, when this is all over, well, we didn't get to implement what we really wanted to implement, and had we had, it would have all been better. But no, they're doing it. And the problem here is we've got massive inflation, probably COVID restrictions returning, inflation on the rise. You've got energy, gas prices on the rise. Farmers are on the brink of bankruptcy because of progressive policy. They've grabbed hold of power, and they're about to lose it quickly in November, and they're starting to realize it, and they're starting to lash out.
I really do like